Single dad worked as a valet, not knowing he once engineered the cars he was parking. 41 guests arrived at the Harlow Grand Hotel on the evening of September the 9th, each one of them driving a vehicle that cost more than most people earn in 3 years. A Bentley Continental, 2 Aston Martins, a Pagani Huayra that the doorman had to look up on his phone because he had never seen one in person. And at the far end of the valet line, in a burgundy blazer, 2 sizes too large, and a white shirt with a collar that had been ironed that morning on a kitchen table, stood Eli Croft, 33 years old, valet attendant, parking cars for $11 an hour plus tips. Beside him, sitting on the low stone wall near the hotel entrance, was his 6-year-old daughter, Wren, waiting for her neighbor to pick her up, holding a small stuffed fox named Rue against her chest. And in the third car of the line, the pearl-white Meridian G-Coupe with the scissor doors and the carbon fiber sills, sat a woman named Serena Holt, who looked at Eli through the windshield, looked at Wren on the wall with her fox, and laughed. Not quietly. She laughed the way people laugh when they believe that rank protects them from being wrong. What she did not know, what no one in that line knew, was who had engineered the car she was sitting in. Keep listening, because the answer is something none of them saw coming. Serena Holt was 32 years old and had been CEO of Meridian Automotive Group for 14 months. Her father, Douglas Holt, had built the company across 26 years from a 2-car prototype shop in Stuttgart into a boutique performance manufacturer with a waitlist of 18 months and a client portfolio that included 2 sitting heads of state and a tech billionaire who had ordered the same model in 4 different colors. Serena had taken the role after Douglas had his first stroke in the summer of the previous year. He was recovering. The recovery was slow. The board had been patient in the way. Boards are patient when they are also nervous, which is to say not very. She had a vice president of design and engineering named Xavier Plum. Xavier was 47 years old, silver-haired, and wore his suits with the specific confidence of a man who has spent a long time making sure other people understood his importance. He had been with Meridian for 11 years. He had outlasted 3 CEOs. He had developed over those 11 years a particular skill for positioning himself at the center of every success and at the edge of every problem, so that when things went well, he was photographed in the room, and when things went badly, he was traveling. It was Xavier who had told Serena that September evening that the annual Harlow client dinner was a tradition she should attend in person. He said the clients responded to FaceTime with leadership. He said it built the kind of loyalty that advertising could not replicate. He arranged her car, the pearl-white Meridian GT, the flagship, to be brought around for her arrival. He had her seated at the table nearest the window, where she could be seen and could see. He had also, that same week, filed a patent amendment with the German Intellectual Property Office. The amendment credited him as sole originating engineer on the lateral load distribution chassis system that was the core innovation behind every Meridian GT ever produced. The original filing, the one made 7 years earlier, had listed a different name. That name was Elias Croft. Eli had been a different kind of man before the burgundy blazer. He did not advertise this. He did not explain it. He was the sort of person who moved through the world as though the world did not require his biography. And the result was that most people he encountered took him for exactly what he appeared to be: a quiet man in a too large jacket who knew how to parallel park a Bentley without leaving fingerprints on the door handle. He was 33 years old. He had a daughter named Wren, who was 6, and who had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of silence in the face of things that other people felt obliged to speak about. Wren carried a small stuffed fox named Rue everywhere she went. Rue had a worn patch on the left ear where the fabric had thinned from years of being held in the same place by the same small hand. Ren called this Rue's thinking spot. She said she could tell when Rue was working something out because that spot got warm. His wife, Clara, had died 22 months earlier, an aggressive cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and the cruelty of that kind of death is different from the sudden kind. Not worse, not better, but a different shape of loss entirely. 14 months of knowing, and of trying not to know, and of making lunches and tying shoes and reading bedtime stories, and holding it together for a 4-year-old who asked questions that had no answers that were fair to give to a 4-year-old. He had held it together. He had not always slept. He had not always eaten. He had held it together. Before Clara died, before the diagnosis, before the 14 months and the hospital parking garage, where he had spent more hours than he could calculate. Before all of it, Eli Croft had been the lead structural chassis engineer at Meridian Automotive Group's Stuttgart facility. He had a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Imperial College London. He had 3 patents in his name, one of which, the lateral load distribution system, filed in 2018, was the innovation on which the entire Meridian GT platform had been built. 41 cars, each one with a waiting list, each one starting at 740,000 euros. He had left Meridian in the spring of 3 years ago. He had sent a single email to HR and one to Douglas Holt's personal address, and he had packed 2 boxes of personal items from his desk in Stuttgart and boarded a flight back to the United States. Because Clara had gotten her second scan result, and the first oncologist had been wrong about the timeline, and Ren was 3 years old and needed both of her parents present for whatever time was left. Douglas Holt had replied to his email within an hour. It was 3 sentences long. It said he understood. It said the door was open. It said to take care of his family. Xavier Plum had said nothing. He had simply moved into Eli's office 2 weeks after Eli left and rearranged the furniture. Eli had not thought about Meridian much in the 3 years since. He had thought about Clara. He had thought about Ren. He had thought about the rent and the grocery bill and the childcare co-op on Ashford Street, where Ren went 3 days a week, and which cost $412 a month. He had done freelance mechanical consulting for a period. Technical documentation work, mostly, reviewing engineering submissions for a small firm in Chicago. But that work had dried up in the winter. The valet position had come through a job board. It paid $11 an hour plus tips. The tips on good nights at the Harlow Grand could be $30 or $40. On very good nights, more. He had taken the job without embarrassment. He was not a man who wasted energy on embarrassment about honest work. He ironed his collar in the morning. He parked the cars carefully. He came home and cooked dinner for Ren and listened to her tell him about Rue's opinions on various matters of kindergarten politics. And he helped her brush her teeth, and he read her 1 chapter. Never 2, always 1, because she would ask for 2 and then 3. And he had learned that the boundary was the kindness. And he turned off her light, and he sat at the kitchen table afterward with a glass of water. And sometimes he opened his laptop, and sometimes he did not. And he went to bed at a reasonable hour, and got up and did it again. The sketchbook was in the drawer of his bedside table. Clara had given it to him the Christmas before she died. It was a technical sketchbook, the kind engineers use. Grid paper, heavyweight, spiral-bound. She had written on the inside cover in her slanted hand. For the things still worth drawing, he had used 17 pages of it. Chassis diagrams, mostly. Stress-load distributions. Things he worked through in the evenings when his mind needed something to do that was not grief. He had not shown the sketchbook to anyone. Ren knew it existed. She had seen him with it once and asked what it was. He had said it was a drawing book. She had asked what kind of drawings. He had shown her one, a frame cross-section, all lines and numbers. and she had studied it with the seriousness she gave Rue's thinking spot, and said, "It looks like a skeleton." He had looked at the drawing and said she was right. She had gone back to her coloring. 3 doors down from Eli's apartment on Fenwick Street lived a man named Theodore Marsh. Theodore was 67 years old and had spent 33 years as a patent attorney, the last 18 of them specializing in automotive and mechanical engineering intellectual property. He was retired and gardened badly and made extraordinarily good soup, and had been, since Clara died, the closest thing Wren had to a grandfather. He came for dinner on Thursdays. He always brought bread. He always asked Wren what Ruth thought about current events, because he was the kind of man who understood that respecting a child's interior world was not condescension, but its opposite. He had known, from the moment Eli moved into the building, that there was something more behind the quiet and the frayed collar. He had seen the kind of precision Eli brought to small tasks, the way he assessed a mechanical problem, the vocabulary he used without thinking. When he talked about the building's elevator maintenance issue, the way he had once, over a Thursday dinner, described the load behavior of a rear suspension system in a way that Theodore could only identify as the speech of someone who had built one. He had never asked directly. He was a patient man. The right moment would come. The right moment came on the evening of September the 14th, 5 days after the Harlow Grand dinner. That evening at the hotel had gone the way those evenings go when a man is invisible in the correct way. Eli had parked 29 cars. He had held umbrellas and opened doors and thanked people for tips delivered with the distracted generosity of people who do not look at the hands they are tipping. He had parked the pearl-white Meridian GT at 8:42 in the evening, pulling it into the underground structure with the same care he gave every vehicle. His hands on the wheel correctly, his foot on the brake measured. He had sat in the driver's seat for 3 seconds longer than necessary before getting out. He had put his hand on the center console. He had felt the particular vibration of the car at idle. The specific harmonic he knew because he had designed for it, had spent 11 months modeling it, had argued about it in a glass-walled conference room in Stuttgart, with 3 other engineers who wanted to tune it out, and had eventually conceded that he was right to preserve it, because it was the signature of the platform, the thing that told the driver's hands they were in something real. He had felt that vibration through the console. He had gotten out. He had walked back to the entrance and taken the next set of keys. He had not said anything to anyone. He did not say anything to Theodore on the following Thursday either. But Theodore was watching his face across the dinner table, while Wren told them, both about a disagreement Rue had with a classmate's stuffed rabbit regarding the best kind of tree, and Theodore saw something in Eli's expression that he could not categorize as tiredness or grief, or the ordinary weight of the life Eli was carrying. It was something more specific, something that had been activated. After Wren was in bed, Theodore stayed at the kitchen table with his tea. He said, "Tell me about the car." Eli looked at him. He said, "What car?" Theodore said, "The one that's been bothering you since Thursday." Eli was quiet for a moment. He looked at his water glass. He said, "I parked a Meridian GT last week." Theodore said nothing. He waited. Eli said, "I used to work at Meridian." Theodore said, "I know." Eli looked at him. Theodore said, "You described a rear suspension load curve over soup 6 months ago. I know what a Meridian GT rear suspension does." The description was not the description of a man who reads car reviews. Eli almost smiled. He did not quite. He said, "I was the lead chassis engineer. I left 3 years ago when Clara got the second scan." Theodore set down his tea. He said, "What did you build?" Eli said, "The lateral load distribution system, the chassis platform the GT runs on. I filed the patent in 2018. Theodore said, "In your name?" Eli said, "In my name, yes." Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is the patent still in your name? Eli looked at him. He had not thought about this. He had not thought about Meridian's patents in 3 years. He said, "It was when I left." Theodore said, "Do you want me to look?" Eli was quiet for a long time. In the next room, Ren was asleep. Rue was on the pillow beside her, the worn patch on the left ear facing up. He could hear the sound of her breathing if the apartment was quiet enough, which it was. He said, "Yes." Theodore looked up the German Intellectual Property Office, filing on his phone, at the kitchen table. He found the patent number Eli gave him. He found the amendment. He found Xavier Plum's name where Eli's had been. He set the phone on the table between them and said nothing. Eli looked at the screen. He looked at Xavier Plum's name. He looked at the amendment date. 4 weeks earlier, while the pearl-white Meridian GT was being driven to a hotel dinner and parked by a man in a too large blazer. Not anger, not shock. Something that had been cold for a long time beginning very slowly to warm. Theodore said, "That amendment was filed without your consent." Eli said, "Yes." Theodore said, "You have the original filing?" Eli said, "Somewhere. With Clara's things, in the storage unit." Theodore said, "Find it." He said it quietly. He said it the way he said everything, without urgency, without theater. But underneath it was something that was not quite urgency, and was not quite theater, but was a third thing that belonged to a man who had spent 33 years knowing exactly what paperwork could do in the right hands. The storage unit on Braddock Avenue held the accumulated weight of a life that had been compacted. Clara's books, her painting supplies, a folded quilt her mother had made, 3 boxes of Eli's engineering files from Stuttgart. The kind of files a careful man keeps because he was trained to keep them. Printed patent applications with their reference numbers, original correspondence from the German IPO, technical specifications cross-referenced to filing dates, and the original collaborative development log from the GT chassis project, 112 pages of it, documenting every iteration, every design decision, every dated revision in Eli's handwriting and countersigned. On 47 of those pages by Douglas Holt himself. Douglas Holt's countersignatures, not Xavier Plum's, not anyone else's. The founder's own hand, across 47 pages, confirming authorship at each stage of the development. Theodore held the development log under the storage unit's single bare bulb and turned the pages slowly and did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "This is everything." He said it the way he had said things in courtrooms for 33 years. Not as excitement, not as relief, but as a statement of technical fact. This is everything, as in, this is sufficient, as in, this ends the matter, as in, the paper knows what happened, even when the people involved have forgotten or chosen to forget. Eli stood beside him with his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at Douglas Holt's signature on the 47th page. He thought about the email Douglas had sent him 3 years ago. 3 sentences. He understood. The door was open. He said, "Douglas doesn't know about the amendment." Theodore said, "How can you be sure?" Eli said, "Because Douglas Holt is not a man who does things like this." Theodore looked at him. He said, "You're sure enough to act on that?" Eli said, "Yes." Theodore closed the development log. He held it carefully. He looked at Eli. He said, "Then we need to make a call. Not to Xavier, not to the board, to Douglas." Eli said, "He had a stroke. He's still recovering." Theodore said, "Then we find out who is authorized to act on his behalf. And we do this correctly." He handed the log to Eli. Eli held the 112-page document in both hands. He felt the weight of it, not just the paper weight. He looked at the cover page, development log, GT chassis lateral load system, project designation ML9, lead engineer, Elias Croft, and he held it the way you hold something you forgot you'd kept, something that has been sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for the moment it was needed. He put it under his arm. He turned off the storage unit light. He pulled down the shutter. He locked it. They drove home in Theodore's car without saying much. It was 10:40 in the evening. Fenwick Street was quiet. Eli could see the light on in Wren's room, not her main light, her small one, the one that glowed amber through the thin curtains, and meant she had woken up and not been afraid, just awake, the way she sometimes was, keeping Rue company in the dark. He sat in the car for a moment after Theodore parked. He thought about the patent number. He thought about Xavier Plum's name where his should have been. He thought about $11 an hour plus tips, and about 41 cars with his engineering in the frame, and about a pearl white GT and a woman who had laughed. He got out of the car. He went upstairs. He checked on Wren. She was asleep. Rue tucked under her chin, the amber light still on. He turned it off gently. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He went to the kitchen table. He opened the development log to page 1. He began to read. Theodore made the call on a Monday morning. Not to Douglas directly. Douglas's recovery was being managed through a home care team, and his daughter Serena had medical power of attorney. But to Douglas's personal attorney, a woman named Frances Aldridge, who had managed Douglas's affairs for 19 years, and who answered the phone in a way that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this kind of call for exactly this long. Theodore explained the amendment. He read her the patent number. He gave her the amendment date. He told her about the development log. Frances was quiet on the line for a moment. Then she said, "Send me the documents." Theodore scanned and sent them from his home office that afternoon. Frances acknowledged receipt at 4:17. She called back at 6:09. She said, "Douglas signed those countersignatures himself. I witnessed 2 of them. I was present when the original patent was filed," she said. "Xavier Plum had no authority to amend that filing, none." Theodore said, "I know." Frances said, "Douglas needs to be made aware of this. His condition is improved enough. He has to know." Theodore said, "I agree, but the conversation should include his CEO, Serena Holt." Frances was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why her?" Theodore said, "Because she's been leading this company for 14 months based on information she may not have had. She deserves to know what she's been leading." Frances said, "I'll arrange a meeting. Wednesday." The meeting was at Douglas Holt's residence on the north side of the city, a converted farmhouse set back from the road, with a garden that had been tended for 30 years and showed it. Douglas was in the sitting room when they arrived. Eli and Theodore and Frances together, seated in a high-backed chair near the window, thinner than Eli remembered from Stuttgart, slower in his movements, but alert in the way that some men become more alert after illness, as though the near miss had burned away everything non-essential. He looked at Eli when he walked in. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Ellie." He said it the way you say a name when you are glad to see the person, and also aware that the circumstances are not gladness, which is a particular kind of tone that older people sometimes know how to use and younger people mostly do not. Eli said, "Mr. Holt." Douglas said, "Sit down." Serena was already there. She was sitting across from her father with a legal pad on her knee, and an expression that was not composure. Exactly, but was the near cousin of it. The expression of someone who has been managing a great deal without sleep and has gotten very good. Looking like that is not what is happening. She looked at Eli when he came in and he could see her assessing, not unkindly, but carefully, the way a CEO looks at a new variable in a room she thought she understood. She did not know who he was yet. Theodore had been deliberate about that. The meeting, as described to Serena, was about a patent dispute requiring her presence. The name Elias Croft had not been given to her in advance. Frances opened the folder on the coffee table. She laid out the documents in order: the original patent filing, the amendment, the development log, the countersignatures. She explained the sequence. She explained the amendment date. She explained, in the clear, unhurried language of a woman who had been explaining legal situations for 3 decades. Exactly what Xavier Plum had filed, and what it meant, and what the original filing said, and who it named. Serena looked at the documents. She looked at the development log. She read the cover page. She read the name. She looked at Eli. She said, "You engineered the GT platform." Eli said, "Yes." She looked at the development log in Francis's hands. She said, "All of it?" He said, "The lateral load distribution system is the core architecture. Everything else on the platform derives from it." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her father. Douglas was looking at Eli with an expression that was not surprise, because Douglas had never been under the impression that Xavier Plum had built his company's flagship technology. Douglas had signed 47 pages himself. Douglas had always known. Serena said, slowly, "Then what has Xavier been?" She stopped. She looked at the amendment date again. She looked at the counter-signatures. She looked at the folder in front of her that Francis had prepared, which contained, in addition to the patent documents, 3 years of expense reports from Meridian's engineering department, pulled at Francis's request by a contact on the board's audit committee. The reports showed a pattern of Xavier taking sole credit in internal presentations and in at least 2 journalist interviews for innovations that the original development logs attributed to a team he had inherited, a team that was no longer there because its lead engineer had left to be with his dying wife. Serena set down the legal pad. She pressed both hands flat on her knees. She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at Eli and said, "I owe you an apology on multiple counts." She said it without preamble, without framing, without the language of institutional regret that is designed to apologize without actually apologizing. She said, "I laughed at you at the Harlow Grand last week. I didn't know who you were. I also didn't ask." She paused. "That's the part that's mine, the not asking." Theodore looked at his hands. Douglas looked at the window. Eli looked at Serena. He said, "Okay." She said, "That's not enough. I know it isn't. But I want to say it plainly before anything else." He said, "You said it plainly." She said, "Xavier will be dealt with, formally and correctly. Francis is already in contact with the German IPO to initiate the amendment reversal. It will take time, but the documentation is unambiguous." She looked at the development log. "This is unambiguous." Douglas spoke then, for the first time since the documents had come out. He said, "Ellie." He said it in the same tone he had used at the door. He said, "What do you need?" Eli looked at the old man in the high-backed chair. He thought about the 3-sentence email. He understood. The door is open. He thought about the storage unit on Braddock Avenue and a 112-page log in the dark. He said, "I need Wren to have a stable home." Douglas said, "Yes," Eli said. "And I need the work to be credited correctly, whatever happens after that." Douglas said, "It will be." He said it the way he said things, apparently, without theater, without qualification. The kind of voice that had built a company across 26 years and had signed 47 pages of a development log because he understood that documentation was not bureaucracy but truth. Serena said, "I'd like you to come in when you're ready. I want to talk about what the next platform needs, and I want to talk to the right person about it." Eli said, "I need to think about it." She said, "Of course," he said. "I have a daughter," she said. "I know. Bring her sometime. We have a design studio she'd probably like." He looked at Serena for a moment. He looked at the woman who had laughed at the Harlow Grand 2 weeks earlier, and who was sitting in her father's sitting room with her hands flat on her knees, not deflecting, not managing, just present. He thought about the burgundy blazer. He thought about Wren on the stone wall, with Rue pressed to her chest. He thought about the pearl-white GT and the vibration through the center console and what it meant to feel the signature of something you built. He said, "I'll let you know." He stood. He picked up his copy of the development log from the table. Francis had made him a certified copy. bound and stamped. He held it at his side. He shook Douglas's hand. Douglas held his hand for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and looked at him and said, simply, "Thank you for what you built." Eli nodded. He could not say anything to that. Some things do not require a response. They just need to be received. He and Theodore walked out together. The garden was quiet in the late afternoon. The light was the particular gold of an October afternoon, low and long across the untrimmed hedges. Theodore said nothing until they reached the car. He said, "How do you feel?" Eli thought about this for a moment. He said, "I need to get home. Ren's at the co-op until 5. Theodore looked at him. He did not push. They drove back to Fenwick Street. Eli picked up Ren at 4:58. She came out of the co-op with her backpack on, and Rue held by one paw, dangling, which was Rue's traveling position. She looked up at him. She said, "Why are you early?" He said, "I had a meeting." She said, "What kind?" He said, "The kind where you talk about work." She considered this as they walked. She lifted Rue up and held the fox properly against her chest. She said, "Did it go good?" "I think so." She thought about this for half a block. Then she said, "Rue thinks you should make dinner now." He looked at the fox. He looked at his daughter. He said, "What does Rue want?" She pressed her face into the fox's soft, worn head for a moment. "Consulting." She pulled back. She said with complete authority, "Rue says soup." 2 weeks after the Wednesday meeting, on a morning in late October, Xavier Plum was called into Meridian's Stuttgart office for what he had been told was a routine quarterly review. The board's general counsel was present. Francis Aldridge joined by video link. The amendment reversal documentation from the German IPO was on the table. Xavier's 3-year run of sole credit presentations was documented in a binder beside it. Photographs, quotes, journalist interviews, internal emails in which he had casually and repeatedly described the GT's core technology as his own design. He attempted, for approximately 8 minutes, to argue that the development log was incomplete, that Eli's departure had been voluntary and constituted an informal reassignment of credit, that the amendment was a clerical correction. He used the word clerical twice. He said it with his hands in his pockets. The general counsel looked at the 47 pages with Douglas Holt's counter-signatures. She looked at Xavier. She said, "The German IPO has already received the reversal petition. The documentation is unambiguous. This meeting is not a discussion. It's a notification." Xavier looked at the binder. He looked at the table. He did not say anything else. He was escorted from the building at 11:22 in the morning with a box of personal items and a separation agreement he had 48 hours to review. His office had a view of the Stuttgart streets below. A woman from facilities came in that afternoon and opened the windows because the room needed air and let the October cold in, and the room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet after something long overdue has finally finished. Eli came to the Meridian Design Studio on a Thursday morning in November. He came alone because Ren was at school and Rue was in Ren's backpack, and Ren had told him that morning, very seriously, that Rue thought he should wear his good jacket, not the burgundy one. He wore his good jacket. Serena met him in the atrium. She had a different quality than she'd had at the hotel. Not warmer, exactly, but more direct, as though the layer of managed certainty had been adjusted. She shook his hand. She said, "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm not committing to anything today." She said, "I know. I just want you to see what we're working on." She walked him through the studio. The new platform work was on the boards. Early stage, still largely conceptual. 3 competing chassis architectures sketched and notated by an engineering team of 9 people who knew they were working on the problem without having cracked it. They had been working on it for 7 months. Eli looked at the boards. He walked along them slowly. The way he moved when he was thinking, deliberate, unhurried. his eyes moving across each drawing in the systematic way of a man whose mind is already running calculations. He stopped at the third board. He looked at the load distribution diagram. He put his finger near one junction point without touching the paper and said, to no one in particular, this node is carrying the wrong load. The engineer nearest him, a young woman named Suki, 28 years old, 2 years out of Zurich, turned and looked at where his finger was. She said, we've been arguing about that junction for 3 weeks. He looked at the diagram for another moment. He said, the load needs to redistribute toward the rear sill by about 12%. The front geometry is compensating for a problem that doesn't exist if you address the sill. Suki looked at the diagram. She looked at him. She said, can you show me? He looked at her. He looked at Serena, who was standing 6 feet away with her arms folded, and the expression of a person watching something confirm what she had suspected. He said, do you have paper? Suki had paper. He sat at the nearest drafting table. He picked up a pencil. He drew in the manner of someone who has been drawing this kind of diagram their entire working life. Quickly but precisely, every line intentional, the proportions correct from the first mark. He drew the sill geometry. He drew the redistribution. He annotated 3 load values from memory, each one with its reference condition. Suki stood beside him and watched. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's it. That's exactly what the simulation's been fighting. He set the pencil down. He looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he looked at the wall of 9 engineers' work. 7 months of it. And at the single junction point where the problem lived, and at the drawing in front of him that had taken 11 minutes. He picked up the pencil again. He drew a second diagram on a fresh sheet. A cross-reference, showing how the sill corrections interacted with the rear damper geometry. He set the pencil down a second time. Serena walked to the table. She looked at both drawings. She looked at him. She said, name your terms. He said, in writing. She said, of course. He said, full credit, all documentation. My name on everything that carries my work, going back and going forward. She said, done. He said, flexible hours. I have a daughter in school. She said, build your own schedule. He said, and I want an office with a window. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. The same third thing it had been at her father's house. The thing that belonged to a person who had been operating in the wrong direction. And had turned around, she said. There's one on the 3rd floor. It's been empty for 2 weeks. He looked at the drawings on the table. He looked at the boards on the wall. He looked at the room full of people who were working on a problem he already knew how to solve. He said, I'll start Monday. He took the 2 drawings from the table. He folded them carefully. Once, twice, the fold precise, the paper flat, and put them in his jacket's interior pocket against his chest. He said, I'll need these. Suki said, I can make copies. He said, make copies. But I keep the originals. He always kept the originals. He left the studio at 11:47. He came back on Saturday with Ren. She wore her blue coat and her rain boots, which she wore most places. And she carried Rue pressed to her chest, the fox's amber eye looking out at the world with the patient attention of a veteran traveler. She walked through the atrium without comment, which was her way of registering that she was paying careful attention. She looked at the drawings on the walls. She looked at the models on the long shelf. She stopped at the scale model of the GT platform and put her face 2 inches from it and studied the suspension geometry. Is that your drawing? He said, something like it. She said, which part? He pointed to the chassis crossmember. He said, this part and this part. And the way they talk to each other. She held Rue up so the fox could see it too. She studied the model in silence for a moment. She said, it does look like a skeleton. Serena came into the studio. She saw Eli at the shelf. She saw Ren. She walked toward them and stopped a few feet away. Then she did something no one in the room had asked her to do. She crouched down, not toward the shelf, not toward the model, down to Ren's level. Down to where a 6-year-old and her stuffed fox were looking at the bones of something her father had built, with the concentration of people who intended to understand it fully. She said, "Your dad made that." Ren looked at her. She said, "I know." Serena said, "It's in every single one of our cars." Ren held Rue up toward the model. She said, "Rue wants to see it better." Serena looked at the fox, at the worn patch on the left ear, at the amber eye. She took Rue gently in both hands and held the fox at the correct height and the correct angle, so that Rue was facing the cross member directly. She said, "How's that?" Ren leaned in close to Rue's face, consulting. She pulled back. She said, "Rue says it's good." Serena handed Rue back. She looked at Ren for a moment. Not the way adults look at children when they are being kind, but the way they look when they are paying actual attention. She said, "Your dad is going to help us build the next one." Ren looked at Eli. She looked at Serena. She said, with the flat, settled certainty of a child delivering a verdict that required no further deliberation, "He fixes everything he touches." Not a boast, not a wish. A fact stated the way 6-year-olds state facts when they have lived close enough to. Something to know it without being told. Serena looked at Eli over Ren's head. He was looking at the shelf, at the scale model. At the crossmember his hands had designed in a glass-walled room in Stuttgart 8 years ago, when Clara was alive and Ren had not yet been born, and the future was still a thing he made plans inside of. He was not quite smiling. Not quite. Serena stood. He walked to his truck. He sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Clara. He thought about the sketchbook in the bedside drawer. For the things still worth drawing. He thought about the storage unit, and the bare bulb, and 112 pages of truth, sitting in the dark for 3 years, waiting for the right question. He thought about Ren telling him this morning, Rue's ruling on the jacket. He almost smiled. He did not quite. He was alone in the truck, and there was no one to see it, and he felt no particular need to complete it. He started the engine. He drove to Ren's school. He was 40 minutes early, which meant he sat in the parking lot with the engine off and the folded drawings in his chest. Pocket and the quiet around him. The particular October, quiet of a school parking lot in the morning, when the day is still mostly ahead. At 12:15 he heard the doors, he heard the voices. He heard, before he saw her, the specific run that he recognized as Ren's. The uneven rhythm of a 6-year-old, carrying a backpack that is too large and a stuffed fox, and not slowing down for either. She came through the gate. She saw the truck. She altered course. She pulled open the passenger door and climbed up, and sat and dropped her backpack, and held Rue up and said, with the gravity of an important announcement, "Rue says you did good today." He looked at the fox. He looked at the worn patch on the left ear, the thinking spot, warm with whatever Rue had been working out. He said, "How does Rue know?" Ren looked at the fox. She looked back at him. She said with complete certainty, "Rue always knows." He looked at her for a moment. He looked at her round eyes and her mother's feet, and the stuffed fox held against her chest with both arms. He said, "Buckle up." She buckled. The seatbelt clicked. Rue was tucked between her arm and her ribs, one amber glass eye looking out at the school parking lot with the patient steadiness of a thing that has seen a great deal and found most of it interesting. He put the truck in drive. He pulled out of the lot. He turned onto the street that led home. The drawings were still folded in his chest pocket, flat against his heartbeat, the load values annotated in his precise and deliberate hand, the paper holding what it always had. Not the future, not the past, just the truth of a thing, correctly recorded, waiting to be used.